Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Hayley Rhodes. I'm a series producer at Woodcut Media. We make a lot of the true crime that hopefully you will have seen some of our shows. And I'm also the host of the True Crime Uncut podcast. I've worked on 3 series of the world's most evil killers and Britain's most evil killers, so very immersed in some of the worst people that roam the planet. One of the things we've realised over the last sort of 10 series that we've made is that very slightly disproportionately there are more murderers in the north of England than there are in the south. It's marginal, we don't need to worry, but there are more. And we've been wondering why that might be, and maybe it's something that, there are theories, but there's no definitive answers, so I'm sure all of you probably have ideas about why that might be, but that's something that we're going to have a look at through some of the cases that we're covering today. I'm aware that I keep echoing and they're not echoing. Is that okay? Is it my scarf? Okay, I'm going to take my scarf off. Right, hopefully that's fixed that. So to introduce the panel, firstly I've got forensic psychotherapist Dr Charlotte Armitage here. If you'd like to just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, hi, I'm a forensic psychotherapist, so my work involves looking at what's happened in an individual's life to lead them towards committing crimes. I've worked on shows like such as Murdered at First Sight, Liar, the fake grooming scandal, and Confessions of a Female Serial Killer, which is going to be coming out later this year.
On Amazon Prime. We've also got Paul Moores, who is a retired Greater Manchester Police homicide detective. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Paul.
Yeah, I'm retired from Greater Manchester Police, this area. I did 30 years, 32 in fact altogether. I'm now a private investigator with my own company, and I was in particular involved in the Nicholas Burton case. I was actually the case officer for it and put the whole file together. So that's me.
I'm going to look in a lot more detail at that case in a moment, but first let's meet Dr Jen Hough, who is a criminologist.
Hi, so my work looks at why people commit crimes and also looks at ways to deviate people away from committing crime. I do lots of research with different agencies, including the police, and I also teach the next generation of researchers and criminal justice practitioners.
Thank you very much. So we're starting off with the case of a guy called Nicholas Burton, and this is one of those cases that is everybody's worst nightmare, mostly in that it doesn't happen that often, but it is a wrong place, wrong time, stranger murder. To give you a bit of a flavour of Nicholas Burton and his crimes, we're going to run a clip now.
In April 1997, in Stockport, Greater Manchester, a 17-year-old girl was abducted at knife point by a stranger. She was held hostage for over 11 hours.
I started to beg him. I didn't show any emotion before, and I was pleading with him not to hurt me.
Unbeknown to his victim, hours before her abduction, the stranger had brutally murdered another innocent woman in a gruesome act of violence.
I've never, ever experienced something as horrific as the circumstances surrounding that case.
The mysterious killer was 27-year-old Nicholas Burton, who did everything he could to prevent being brought to justice.
You've still got no sense of any motive, no reason why has this happened.
Psychiatrists agreed that Burton was one of the most unstable people they'd ever assessed.
This is something that is part of who this man is, and he's going to continue to be a danger.
Nicholas Burton had been exposed as one of the world's most evil killers.
So, Paul, you, as you said, you were heavily involved in that investigation. So tell me a little bit about the case.
Yeah, he left his home address on foot and he walked all the way to Bramhall in Stockport, where he intended to rape and kill that evening. Poor Rachel McGrath, who was a judge's daughter, went to pick a boyfriend up at closing time, and it was estimated it was about 11:05. There was no witnesses outside whatsoever. He went over to her, had a conversation with her. She fought back to try and get rid of him, but he threatened her with a knife, and he killed her in horrific circumstances. He actually hacked her neck. He then stabbed her to get her onto the floor, we believe, to incapacitate her through the back of the upper thigh, to the extent you could see the shape of the knife, the triangular shape of the knife, almost coming through the front. It was horrific. He stabbed her a couple of times more as well in other places, but about 8 hours later, he walked to Heel Green, which is about 3 or 4 miles away, and poor Debbie Van Gerco was on her way to work, part-time at Marks and Spencer's. She stops for provisions in a shop. When she came out, she was abducted by him at knife point, and she had an 11-hour ordeal. At one point, she was put in the boot of the car for an hour, and she was tied with the seatbelt webbing round her wrists and kept in that position. Fortunately, there was an opportunity for her to escape when she was on a petrol forecourt in Carnarvon in North Wales, and she did manage to escape right into the lap of a taxi driver. And we sort of linked both offences, more of a gut feeling than anything else. I went to North Wales in a traffic car at speed, I must say, and that's when it all started, trying to find him. We found him in a hotel where he was in a position where he'd been chatting with a ladies' darts team who was suspicious, and that was the culmination of his arrest. I personally briefed the firearms officers because I'd been to the scene, so I couldn't contaminate the scene of the murder, that was. And we got him, and all the evidence, the knife was there. He had a jacket which had got what looked like blood on the jacket, turned out to be Rachel McGrath's blood. He was very obstructive when it came to interviews. He wanted female officers to take his meals to the cells. He made no reply throughout all the interviews. He manipulated the system, and he actually tried to get the case adjourned on 2 occasions where suddenly he manipulated a defence of manslaughter and diminished responsibility. The judge didn't wear it at all, and the judge said, when he was found guilty, life means life. No Home Secretary will ever sign to let you out. But just recently, over the last 12 months or so, he's put a claim in. He's in a mental institute, and he's not succeeded with that. We're hoping that that remains the case for the rest of his life. One thing with the court case that's absolutely forefront to my mind is that he was asked a question by his defence barrister, what were you intending to do with Debbie Van Gerco? And he said, you could have heard a pin drop in the courtroom. I was going to rape her, kill her, and then move on to my next victim. He's a very dangerous man, described as a monster by Debbie Van Gerco. She has not recovered. She's still in trauma. All her family are the same, and the same with, you saw Michael McGrath, who was Rachel's brother. His family are still suffering. I have flashbacks. I'll never, ever forget that case.
This kind of murder is mercifully rare. What are your feelings, Charlotte, on stranger murders, and how does a person come to have this kind of intent? I mean, I know that Paul has told me that he's never managed to have a good conversation with Nicholas Burton where he got any answers, and he'd still like to have that. And it does seem as though he maybe shouldn't be paroled until you know why he did it, and then you know how much chance there is of him doing something like this again. But I mean, what motivates this kind of murder?
I think without knowing about his child and his history, it's very difficult to understand what's motivated him to do it. I mean, we do know that there was a relationship breakdown at the age of 21, obviously struggled with that abandonment that he experienced, didn't have healthy coping strategies, turned to drugs and alcohol, which seemed to exacerbate this behaviour. But once he decided to go on a killing spree, there was no stopping him, as we've just heard. So, I mean, it's difficult without knowing. I have looked, actually. I've tried to find, and I don't know if you know much about his early years or anything like that. I have tried to find information, but couldn't find anything in the public domain about him and his childhood, his parents, what his life was like.
Yeah, he was from a respectable family, believe it or not. And I actually interviewed his mother and his father. And at one point, it was believed that he may have tried to castrate himself as his psychiatric problems were getting worse. And that was never sort of proven, but he did have a drug problem and an alcohol problem, and that probably sort of drew him towards it. But what sparked him to do that particular murder, we don't know. We found history that he had jumped out when people were jogging down a footpath, a disused railway line, and he was asking for money. And the significant feature that really caught him in the end was that he smoked cigars and he drank Guinness. And that was what made my mind up when I got to North Wales to say, right, we need a firearms team to that hotel now. And it was significant because the darts team had mentioned it, and Debbie Van Gerko mentioned it to me when I interviewed her at Carnarvon Police Station. You know, so, and he was also found he'd been witnessed in the pub, the Victoria in Bramhall, talking to people, and they said there was a guy that was strange who had been smoking cigars and drinking Guinness. 2 girls left the pub and were the luckiest people alive. They went down a pathway near to the pub, and he followed them a little bit earlier than the murder took place. They split and he lost them, which is, we never traced those girls.
I mean, it is very much a case of wrong place, wrong time for both of his victims, the survivor and Rachel, who was killed. I mean, how much gender... These stranger murders where it's really just, I mean, for all of us, it's kind of there, but for the grace of God, it hasn't happened to you. But I mean, how much kind of disproportionate fear do those kind of murders strike in people?
I think it's natural to be in a community where something like this happens and to feel that fear, because it becomes very close to the people who live there. But as you've said, stranger murders are thankfully incredibly rare. You are much more likely to be killed by somebody that you know, which I'm not sure how that makes people feel, but you are much more likely to be killed by somebody, particularly if you're a woman and in the domestic space as well. So thankfully stranger murders are rare, but when one does happen, I think it sort of reverberates through the community very, very significantly, because people naturally will feel, well, that could have been me. Well, what if it's me next? And I think sometimes the media attention that those cases gain cause something that we would refer to as a moral panic, where it feels like a very sort of significant event that happens that must happen more than it actually does. But when you look at the statistics, it doesn't. So the idea of like a moral panic within the media is very significant on people and on communities, but often it's not as prevalent as we think it is, particularly when cases like this happen.
I wonder if any of you have a feeling on what Burton's motivations were. As we've said, he didn't give much away. We don't know that much about his childhood, but what motivates this kind of murder and this desire to repeatedly carry this act out?
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts are, I suppose, a little bit biased, even though as a professional investigator, I'm completely impartial. He certainly wasn't proved to have mental health issues when he was convicted, and he was certainly a very clever, calculated person when it came to manipulating the authorities right the way through from the start of the investigation to the court case and the trial, and he didn't give a monkey's. He showed no remorse whatsoever. Absolutely none.
I think that the trauma that he experienced with that relationship breakdown when he was 21, not having a healthy way of dealing with it, starting to take drugs and alcohol, becoming more isolated and withdrawn from everyone, so he was on his own quite a lot. I think the drugs, it did sound like, with the self-circumcision, that that doesn't sound like something that a healthy person would do. So then I have a question around mental illness there. But I think it's that hatred towards, I think the feeling that he felt when he was abandoned, but that's how he perceived that relationship breakdown. I think that's then being projected out onto seemingly all women. And I think that on some sort of unconscious level was driving his hatred towards women and really fueled. I mean, he might well have already had high levels of psychopathy there as well, because we've all felt abandoned, had relationship breakdowns, don't necessarily go out and kill people. And like you said, there was no remorse. That could have been that he'd completely detached to enable himself to commit these crimes and compartmentalize any emotion, but it certainly sounds like the catalyst of it was this breakdown.
We actually traced that ex-girlfriend, and I went down to Great Yarmouth to interview her. I was expecting her to say, oh, he had he was a strange character with sexual deviances of some nature. But no, she said he was just normal at that time, which surprised me. And I've since, through my profession now, met another girlfriend of his, and she said exactly the same, but she did see signs of him going off the rails a bit when he started on drugs. So it seems to be a key figure. But at the end of the day, he's a calculated killer and potential rapist. If we hadn't have caught him when we did, he would have caused mayhem.
You can see the power dynamics there from what you said. I didn't know that about when you did catch him.
Yeah.
He wanted female officers to bring him his meals. And I think that's very interesting, of that need to dominate and need to feel that women are subservient to him.
Yeah.
Just something so small in his behaviour there is very, very indicative, I think, of his sort of wider behaviours outside before you did catch him.
Yeah, he insisted on having a female solicitor as well as police women taking him. Various things.
Women are there to serve him, almost.
He hates women.
Yeah, hates women, yeah.
But it's interesting when you see the picture of him, and he looks quite innocuous. He doesn't look like a guy that you would necessarily feel any fear of if you were to come across him in daily life, which is really interesting. Actually, we're going to move on to talking about somebody else who literally moved among the population, was in a caring role, and yet was essentially a predator. Definitely was a predator. So we're going to talk about Harold Shipman, who was a GP, actually from your neck of the woods, he, look at you, he's believed to have killed over 250 of his patients. So Paul, just give us a little bit of a summary of who Harold Shipman was and what he did.
Harold Shipman was a strange character. He was certainly a bit of a loner. I didn't personally work on this case, but I was in the police at the time when, as a detective, when he was captured, if you like. He was absolutely incensed with females, and over a period of a long time, he was giving, I think it was diamorphine, to patients that weren't really as ill as he thought. He knew. And he just wanted, he had this hate for them and thought it was an easy way out. And I think he'd lost his mother or something.
At 43. She was 43.
And that affected him quite badly. But it was that calculated that when it came to his wife's 60th birthday, she was entitled to extra money from the will or something like that. And he actually committed suicide a couple of days before the actual birthday. That's how calculated he was. But somewhere in the region of 400 people are believed to have been killed by him with the injection of diamorphine. You know, so I wouldn't have liked him as my doctor. And just as an aside, where I used to live at one point, the first victim that brought him to justice was Kathleen Grundy. I lived about 100 yards from her house. I never knew her until it all broke, you know, and very strange and bizarre. But I'm just glad my surgery was elsewhere.
Jen, do you have a feeling about why or how someone's able to get away with this number of killings in that kind of circumstance before they're detected? Because it took a really long time. And I think it was quite random people that detected him, like a taxi driver who noticed he was taking a lot of older women to hospital appointments who then weren't really making it home and who hadn't seemed that ill when he took them. And it was people like that picked it up. So why is it so difficult to detect this kind of crime?
I think naturally within our society, we trust doctors. Doctors are one of the individuals that are there to help and support us in our times of need. So naturally, there's already that benchmark of trust and respectability as well. So it isn't, as you said before, about the way somebody looks. Already there's that trust element is gained because of their standing within society. They're not automatically someone who would arouse suspicion. But with Shipman's victims as well, because they were older, not necessarily as unwell as he made them out to be, that suspicion perhaps wasn't there as much as it would be if they were younger victims, for example. It's not unusual that older people may pass away unexpectedly, but the significance of the numbers of people that, like you just said then, it potentially up to 400, they know it's at over 250, potentially up to 400. That's absolutely phenomenal in terms of the amount of people that he has potentially taken their life. So the standing, I think, in society plays a huge role in that. The lack of suspicion, because automatically he's a doctor, he's there as a caring individual. But also he was very charismatic, I think. He played the part very, very well. So he was beloved by his patients as well. I think when he opened his own surgery, he took the majority of his previous patients with him. So he was very, very adept at gaining trust as well. He already had that because he was a doctor. It's like kind of an automatic trust, but he was very, very good at manipulating the situation as well.
Charlotte, we know that to an extent he was motivated by financial gain. I know there were some older people whose wills he changed, and actually that's one of the reasons he was caught, because it was quite a huge bequest and he changed it away from this woman's children to himself, which is a bit of a rookie error, I think. But it can't have just been financial gain. What is driving this kind of prolific killing?
I think with him specifically, this was about control, about pushing boundaries. So we know that his mum was really controlling with him as a child, which I would love to know why. You know, is it that it was mum had a controlling nature, or was it because she saw something in the child that needed to be controlled? So we know that mum was controlling. He didn't have very many friends. It'd be nice to know, I suppose, was she controlling with all of the siblings in the sibship? Because there were 4 siblings. She was certainly controlling with him. Then the mother died when he was 17 years old. And I think when you've grown up in a world where everything is very controlled for you, you don't understand where boundaries lie. So you're constantly pushing them. And he was doing that throughout his career. We know he got addicted to pethidine, which is an interesting drug because actually that's mainly used in labour. So he got addicted to pethidine, and the repercussions of that were, I don't think they really fit the crime, really. He should have had his licence revoked. He slap on the wrist, basically. So then I think in his mind he thought, right, I can keep going. It might have been that first murder that he did was he'd seen his mother die of cancer. He'd seen her being injected with diamorphine, which took the pain away. He perhaps liked the power that you're playing with life and death. And it might be that he enjoyed that for the first crime, but then that feeling of being able to take someone's life. We know he's got an addictive personality. He got addicted to diamorphine throughout his career. Did he get addicted to that feeling of killing as well? So I think it's quite a complex case with him. Obviously, high levels of narcissism. He didn't even want to explain himself. He was a doctor. He was used to just doing what he wanted to do. Obviously, he took his own life, the ultimate control. But I think the death of the mother was significant. I think the fact that morphine was used in her to relieve her pain was significant. I wondered whether, because most of his victims were over the age of 43, and his mum died at 43, and I wondered whether there's either anger towards the mother for leaving him when he was 17, because there was such an enmeshed relationship there, and also whether there's anger at other families who still get to have their mother after the age of 43, because he didn't have that. So I think unconsciously it was really quite complex as to what was driving it. And so the sort of trust element of him being a doctor, him also being allowed to just prescribe huge amounts of morphine, even though we already knew that he was addicted to morphine. You know, you wouldn't be allowing doctors to handle that level of morphine now if you knew they'd had a prior addiction to the substance. You know, he was enabled in that way, really. His position of power enabled him to get away with it for so long.
I think with that as well, I agree with you there, Charlotte, about the control and his mother. But the other thing is, if you think of a GP, it's a very lonely job. He's on his own. So all he's speaking to is patients all the time. And I know of a doctor that was actually my parents' doctor who was that keyed up about it, he committed suicide. You know, so maybe there was a bit of loneliness there as well, and he liked to have that power to control his patients.
I mean, it is something that's been in the news a lot recently with the Lucy Letby case, that I don't know whether it is that the medical profession attracts people that have that kind of God complex, or whether, I mean, in a lot of cases of crimes, we see people just targeting their victims where they can, you know, working in schools or working in religious institutions. So is there a particular kind of God complex that is more common among people that work in the medical profession?
I think there's maybe two ways to look at that. People who work in that environment, we're more shocked when we hear about something like that. I mean, obviously, Shipman is a little bit of an outlier just purely through the number of victims that he had, but it's also almost more shocking if it's a medical professional, because they are there and to help us be well. And it contradicts that, you know, so completely that I think it creates kind of maybe more of a sort of a shock value. And often we have different types of offenders within that narrative as well. So people who maybe take the life of one of their patients because they think that they're suffering. So they like an angel of death almost. Whereas Shipman was very much around, there was clearly quite a bit of anger there. You know, his patients weren't suffering largely. They were generally quite well. He ended their life. You know, they weren't at end of life. They weren't suffering like his mother was. So, and it's interesting, you know, that the victim profile, as Charlotte said then, they were women over the age of sort of, you know, 43. So I think we're more shocked when we hear that it's medical professionals, because it's the opposite or the antithesis of what they should be doing.
Something that I was thinking about during talking about Nicholas Burton, but also Harold Shipman, is yes, they both suffered adverse life events that were quite traumatic, but obviously nearly all of us will suffer some kind of traumatic adverse life event, and we don't do that. So what is it about them that tips them over into doing something unspeakable?
I think this is why I wondered about the mother being controlling. Why was she controlling? What does that say about him as a child? Was it that mum's controlling? Was it that actually she saw something in her son that she was concerned about? That's why she kept him away from other children. You know, if she was controlling with all the siblings, then maybe it was to do with her. But there's normally a predisposition as well. It's a combination of factors, because like you say, we all go through adverse life experiences and we don't all handle it that well. But it's that perfect storm, which is what happened in both of those cases.
Actually, that brings us on to the third case that we're going to talk about, because this was someone who showed signs from a very early age that he was not like everybody else, and that it wasn't going to take much to tip him into quite horrendous behaviour. So I recently made a programme for Amazon Prime about Stephen Griffiths, who's otherwise known as the Crossbow Cannibal, and he was a Bradford criminology student who took the lives of 3 women who worked in the sex trade, and in very calculated ways he ingratiated himself with that community. He invited them around to his flat for a cigarette, a beer, and then ended up killing 3 of them. And the reason he was caught, which is something that is probably seared into a lot of people's memory because it was so horrific at the time, is that there was CCTV footage of one of the women escaping his flat and running down the corridor, and he pursues her with a crossbow and kills her. And it was that CCTV footage that alerted the authorities to what he'd been doing. And yeah, I think he's someone. I interviewed his sister, who hadn't really spoken to the media before. She was still sort of 15 years on, trying to process what had happened. But I spoke to her, and she said that the signs were there from a very young age, from probably 8 years old, that he was sadistic, that he had no empathy, that he didn't really want to adhere to the boundaries that society had put in place for him. And he was someone who was always going to be a problem, but I don't think that anybody quite perceived the degree to which he was going to be a problem. And I wonder whether in that kind of a case, it's maybe a question for Jen in the first instance, is to what extent should society or the police or anybody be spotting those warning signs about someone like Stephen Griffiths right from a young age? Like, how to what extent can we spot someone like him coming?
I think in some ways it's very difficult because you really require agencies to speak to each other in a very, very detailed and complete way. And just as we know, that doesn't always happen. The public sector is very stretched. Young people can often grow out of things as well. They're finding their feet. They may behave in a way that we wouldn't deem to be a sort of a normal or an acceptable way, but that dissipates as they get a bit older. In this case, there were many incidences, I think, that really highlighted that something was not okay, and that really, got worse as he got older. It's very difficult to join those dots together beforehand, I think, at times. Flags can be raised about young people's behaviour, particularly if they're doing things as I know that he did with animals, and that's often a sign that someone is lacking empathy or is very interested in the macabre. I think that would be a sign. But he had a lot of instances where things could have been spotted, I think, and should have been, probably just for the number of different wide-ranging episodes that he had before he got to that point where he took life.
Mm-hmm. I think from a police perspective, we didn't share information with other agencies and vice versa. But the signs were there, as Jen said, early doors. And it was building up slowly but surely to an explosion point. And the 3 murders he did, he was trying to copy the likes of the Yorkshire Ripper and Peter Sutcliffe. And he actually said at one point, if I've read it right, that he wanted to be better than him.
Yeah, outdo him.
He was his hero.
He did. He actually thought that Peter Sutcliffe had kind of dropped the ball by being caught after 13 murders, and that he thought he could best him. And unfortunately, he didn't turn out to be fortunately, didn't turn out to be as clever as he thought he was, because he was caught after the 3rd. But that was his ambition. He wanted to be notorious. He wanted to be better than Peter Sutcliffe. And there were elements of his crimes that he really tried to play up, like the cannibalism, because I think he wanted to create that notoriety for himself. I would just wonder, Charlotte, if someone had picked up better than they did on these traits that he had from a young age, is there anything, what can happen, what can be done with someone like that so that they don't go down this path, they don't escalate to murder?
Yeah, I think there were, you've just mentioned missed opportunities in police, but even with Newton Lodge, so he was an outpatient there, he was seen at Rampton, so these are specialist forensic psychiatry services that didn't seem to pick up how much of a risk this individual was to society. There could have been interventions put in place. I mean, it's a compounding effect. So his sister said as a child he would inflict harm onto animals, which is always a concern in child development. If a child is behaving like that, can be indicative of a conduct disorder, certainly indicative of psychopathic traits. I think if someone's brain has a level of psychopathy, they don't feel in the same way that others do. But not everybody who has high levels of psychopathy go on to kill or murder or hurt anybody. And it's about the environment then. So he has this predisposition, he has these traits, the environment that he's then in at home. We know that he witnessed, that the parents divorced, mother had regained her social life. She was allegedly having sex with men in the back garden. I think it's interesting that he's ended up going for sex workers. There's something about, I think, potentially if he's seen mum involved in this kind of behaviour, and maybe as a child with this predisposition hasn't liked that. We don't know what went on thereafter. I think he showed signs and he got into trouble with the police.
Yeah, he started kind of building up a cache of weapons when he was in his teens, and then I think when he was doing a lot of things like shoplifting, but then when he was 17 it escalated to using a knife on somebody. He slashed a store manager across the face when he was caught shoplifting. So he did show a kind of willingness to violence, and also violence against his siblings from a really early age, like quite extreme violence. So the signs were there. I think a lot of what happened was kept within the home. I don't imagine, for example, the authorities knew about him harming his pets and things like that. But when he was 17, it was the first time it was kind of publicly obvious that he had a problem.
See, now, if a child was harming pets, that would be a red flag, and we'd look at intervention, look at what's happening for that child, and look at what could be done to prevent it escalating to this point. But obviously back then, this wasn't done.
It's very strange because the store manager at the time had to have 17 stitches. Well, that's a hell of a wound.
Yeah, that's not a small thing.
So the signs were there without a shadow. And I don't think that we shared enough information in those particular days. Peter Sutcliffe, as an example there, was locked up on a gut feeling by 2 uniformed police officers that were just sticking the nose in to a car, which they thought might be stolen. The next thing is it all escalated.
But this guy, I think he was allegedly good looking, he was charming, and I think that would have been disarming. So I think that's how he would have got away with it like that. But he was how was he was assessed as sadistic, schizoid personality, but still released back into society. And he was very open about wanting to murder people. So it was missed across.
It was, because he was on the radar of the domestic violence people for his relationship with his girlfriend Kathy, and then he stalked her for a good 7 or 8 years after she broke up with him. So he was very much on everybody's radar, but no one kind of joined the dots to see just how dangerous he was. But I think, Jen, that's an escalation that's probably not that unusual. If you're willing to cross certain boundaries, you push a lot of boundaries.
And as we've seen and as we've heard, that's happened from him being a young age as well. So, 17 and causing that level of injury, being younger, obviously with his siblings and with animals, it is an escalation, but it's one that was in some ways actually quite a slow burner. It almost could have been stopped, I think, much, much earlier had agencies spoken to each other, like we've said. And I think just about education, as Charlotte said then, if this was happening now, then I think generally people are much more aware and are more willing to be able to talk about things and to seek help, whereas at this point it's very much kind of kept within the household. His behaviour, I think, is quite interesting because it isn't all in one particular route either. There's violence across the board, so it isn't only aimed at women, or it isn't only aimed at intimate partners, it isn't only aimed at animals, or it was everybody, I think, was potentially in that firing line. And that's perhaps harder to spot as a pattern because it could be anyone, men, women, partners, non-partners, people he didn't know, at kind of college campuses and stuff. So that's kind of harder to pinpoint. And I think when you look at somebody like him and a kind of an individual like him, that element of violence is there, but it's really spread out as well. And I think that does make that harder to get on top of.
I think he was crying out to be caught because when he was caught, he confessed to everything too easily. Yeah. You don't get that.
I think
in
his
real
behaviour
life.
to the CCTV camera as well was really interesting.
Yeah, when he puts his finger up.
Yeah, so you mentioned then about him saying, Peter Sutcliffe almost didn't do a good job because he was caught after 13, whereas, he's been caught on CCTV and put his fingers up to the camera and then come back out and had a drink and cheersed it to the camera. So he is aware of what he's doing there. It's performative, isn't it? He's performing for the camera and for the police that will inevitably see that, and for what he is hoping, I think, that the public will see that. That's what he wants. He wants that notoriety. So he is, I think, as Charlotte said as well, you know, he's talking quite openly about his intentions. He almost wants people to know. He wants that notoriety, but he's not hiding it either, I don't think. And that's quite worrying.
How can you actually eat some of the flesh from the murdered victims?
I mean, if he did as well, I think that's something else to perhaps think about. There's no real evidence that he did that. No. But that's one of the most shocking things that I think as a human being we could do or say. So did he actually do that? Or is he almost bigging himself up as being worse than he really is? And I would probably take everything he said with a bit of a pinch of salt.
He's fundamentally a little boy that wants someone to pay attention to him, and he's going about it in the wildest way possible.
And increasingly so, I think.
One thing I do have to ask before we quickly move on to what if murderers are more common in the north and why. We're in a room full of true crime enthusiasts. This guy was a criminology student. There's been a couple of other cases recently of criminology students murdering. And are they pushed towards criminology because of that desire within them, do you think?
I mean, hopefully they're not any of my students. I think, again, that's when how many people who engage in this type of behaviour are science students or maths students, or it's because it's seen as more shocking. I think, have they had some sort of insider knowledge into this? Is that why they've been drawn to it and attracted to that area? That is quite possible. I think if you are that way inclined, that you are following, serial killers as a sort of, that's a hero, then a natural interest in criminology is probably going to be there in some way. You might want to understand why people behave the way that they do and how to almost, commit the perfect crime. We don't teach that, by the way. It's, but it's not unusual that they would think that might, assist them in their endeavours in some way. But yeah, there have been some kind of high-profile cases, whether that is as a way of kind of having a barrier, almost like hiding behind it, I don't know. But I would just like to say the majority of criminology students don't engage in that, as far as I know.
I think for him, he was trying to understand himself, and I think that's what the fascination with psychology and criminology was, probably trying to no one else could understand him, siblings didn't understand him, parents didn't understand him, services didn't seem to understand him. So I think he was trying to understand himself, quite likely by being drawn into this world. And doing a PhD, that's an intense level of study, so and on a very specific topic as well. I think it's probably self-discovery.
And I think that's interesting with the PhD thing as well. I'd forgotten about that. It was looking at a very, very specific topic of murderers within a kind of geographical area, but historically. And I think that's quite interesting, where he wasn't doing a PhD where you need to go out and do empirical research and interviewing people working within the criminal justice spaces. It's almost controlled. It's looking at murder, but in a sort of a kind of controlled way, and a step back from actually dealing with criminal justice agencies as well. So I find that quite interesting, where it's very much kind of hands off in some ways, not too involved, but still within that space.
Well, it allows him to live in the fantasy, in his head, and I think that's what he'd created, is this fantasy world, which because he created a persona, didn't he? Which I think allowed him to commit these horrific crimes, compartmentalise them as not belonging to him. But I think a lot of this study was like you're saying there, he doesn't actually have to be involved in the reality of what's going on.
We're out of time, but I do need to know if anyone has any theories quickly about why the north of England might be, why there might be more murders in the north of England compared to the south of England. Are there any theories in the room?
Might be one for you there, Paul.
Well, I think back in the day in GMP, we had the best murder teams in the country, and we went out and detected the vast majority of them. And they were great detectives. As a team working on the Nicholas Burton case, I was a divisional DS at the time, Detective Sergeant on Stockport Division. And it's one of those, isn't it, where I had a cracking team and we actually thrived on the adrenaline of investigating that. It was fascinating, but it was very emotive and it was very emotional. But we controlled that until we were out of that environment. And like the gentleman before, Colin Sutton, said, our way around that in those days was to go out and have a few pints. After we got the result, the locals in the local pub in Bramhall were buying us drinks all night. I've never had such a bad headache in all my life as I did the next day.
Right, thank you so much, Paul. We better wrap it up there. So we've got Paul Moores, we've got Dr Jen Hough and Dr Charlotte Armitage. Thank you so much.